Hi, my name's Dr. Esther Cole. I'm the founder and director of a multi-award-winning international team, Lifespan Psychology, the Diverse Practice. I'm a consultant clinical psychologist, life coach and therapy business coach, and the first Black clinical psychologist to receive the BPS Early Career Award. I run individual and group coaching sessions for therapy bosses aspiring to build their team. BOSS stands for Business Owner Support Squad. Welcome to the Breaking Through Therapy podcast. This is the only podcast that supports you to come on the show with your therapist at least 1 year later to talk about the breakthroughs that you've made along your journey and its impact on your life ever since. So this is the Mental Wellness Podcast for people interested in having talking therapy, professionals who deliver talking therapy, and everyone in between. Hello and welcome to the Breaking Through Therapy podcast, the charity podcast for NHS Charities Together. Today I'm joined by the wonderful James and Beth Ashley-Smith, who's a psychotherapist and mental health nurse specialising in addictions. Thank you so much for coming today. I think that this is going to be a really important conversation to have. When I met you both, it was groundbreaking. Quite honestly, it was the most intense but also uplifting conversation I've had in a long time. And I think it's going to be really powerful and really helpful for lots of people. So James came to therapy to see Beth in the Priory. Don't know which year it was now. You'll have to tell me what year it was.
It was 2019 and it was 5 years next Tuesday.
Okay, brilliant. You remember the day.
Oh, yeah.
That's the power of that connection, isn't it? That you remember it to the day. So 2019, almost 5 years. You explained that at the age of 10, James, you'd had a very traumatic experience that you were unable to talk to any adults about, and it left you isolated. Ever since then, you've struggled with depression, low mood. And then later on, 80s and 90s, you were saying that you struggled with addiction. And it was when you had your own children that things really came to the surface. And it sounds like you thought that life wasn't worth living at the time. And I just can't imagine how awful, to be in that state where you feel unable to exist, unable to be, and to have small children to take care of.
Yeah. I mean, later on, I'd sort of pushed all of those thoughts and emotions down, later on when we had children, especially when they got to the same sort of age, around that 10 age, they're starting to go to, out of school clubs and things like that. Well, my behaviour was really controlling. I started to enrol myself in all of the out of school groups. I'll go to Scouts and help out. I'll go to cricket and help out. I'll make sure that I'm there at gymnastics, really just to kind of suss out whether or not I was going to be DBS checked, and therefore is anyone else there DBS checked. And it was that real fear that something that was likely to happen. And the only way that I could really cope with dealing with those fears was to suppress the feelings. That would either be extreme exercise. I'm just going to run up this hill. I'm going to go running for a day. Or it could be over shopping and compensating in that way, just trying to get myself out of that. Or, in the end, it just turned into alcohol and drug abuse, ultimately. At that point, I was just lost. And it didn't take long to get to that stage either.
And what you're doing is an incredibly brave act. And I know you've done a lot of work in your community as well to support people who've been through similar experiences and who have had issues with drugs and alcohol. Do you feel comfortable sharing with the audience what it is that had happened? So a lot of men don't feel able to, and a lot of men and boys really do suffer in silence and don't feel able to talk to anyone until, as you say, it comes very late on in life. And
yeah, I mean, I've noticed a lot of that, certainly in the areas in which I talk to people in the evenings, during the group meetings and stuff. I've noticed a lot of people struggle with being vulnerable. This happened a long time ago for me, 10 years old. Actually, it happened off the back of a very young but obsessive relationship. This girl that I knew was moving away and I wanted to go and find her. So I lied to my nan and rode out on my bicycle. It was on my birthday or nearabouts my birthday. Went across this park in the fresh snow. And I knew that, inside I was doing something wrong. So when someone came up to me and said, "Oi, what are you doing?" then instinctively I felt that I was in the wrong. And I thought I was going to die. In fact, I actually pleaded for my life with this guy. Thing is, as well, when you're in that situation, you see life itself passing you by. You're in this situation that you can't get out of. You see the cars on the other side of the park all driving down the street. The park itself was cold and quiet. There was snow on the ground. You know what the sound's like when there's snow. There's no sound, there's no birds, there's nothing, but you see life. And then after that, I just cycled home and, I removed all of my underwear and threw it away because it was blood and I didn't want to be found out. And I just went home. I remember consciously thinking to myself all those years ago that if I don't say anything, this is going to go away. And, that's one of those decisions that you consciously make when you have these types of traumas. It's not until later on that after playing it back thousands and thousands of times that it's going to come out. And that I'm playing it back an awful lot more times than the person who committed the crime, who I'm sure just moved on. As I then went into secondary school, I felt I was isolated, I was different. And I was isolated. I didn't know anyone at that school. We just moved out of that area and I was different, regardless of whether or not it had happened to anyone else. And no one else was talking. So that instinctively brought me into more isolated behaviours. And that remains one of the key areas of my character, is that when things are bad, I'm the one that's going to, go to the back of the cave and sit quietly until the danger has passed. I know that I isolate and I know that that's a dangerous place for me to be now. And that's really what I've learned. Well, one of the things that I've learned through Beth is that, the isolation and not being able to talk about these things, not being able to express your darkest thoughts and your past is not healthy. And these things do need to come out. And like you say, the more you talk about it, the easier it is for other people to recognize that these things happened. The person that committed the crime is sick, and you can either live in the pain and let it become part of your identity, or you can just say, you know what, that's happened to thousands of people. God knows what happened to that guy, but I just got to let it go, and you kind of live in that forgiveness for a little bit, difficult, but that's what you do.
Thank you so much for sharing that. When I work with survivors of sexual assault, the most painful thing that's repeated in our sessions is that blame, the self-blame. It's almost universal, and it's like the projection of the perpetrator's own blame is into the survivor of the sexual assault. So you're carrying all those feelings, all that responsibility, all that blame that they should be having. That's one of the most painful parts of the process, is not knowing that you're worthy of support, love, care, kindness, that person, needs to be punished, sentenced. And that's what's really painful about the work, isn't it, Beth? I know we haven't talked to you much yet. It'd be great to bring you in, because I think what we need to know, what our listeners need to know, is how do we build a relationship with somebody like James, who has shut down and who is withdrawing? And it's just incredible that you were able to reach him. And I know that from what you explained, James, you had therapists in the past, but actually, they hadn't been able to connect with you. And I just think this is kind of the magic. It's, how does that therapeutic relationship begin?
Wow, it's an interesting point, because on reflection, a lot of what we've talked about today wasn't stuff we worked on at the time directly. And I think that's really key to know, because what you've talked about today, James, I was writing down some key words as you're speaking. And one of the things that the first one is shame in capital letters, is how powerful that is in actually keeping us stuck, but actually in recovery, it's really important. So to just absolutely put our arms around it. However, my experience of people coming into addiction therapy is something that might keep someone stuck, or, trauma therapy too, is being able to talk about something that we've wanted to keep hidden for a long, long time. So for me, there's something about looking at someone in the place they're in rather than that big label, and the big stuff, and building the relationship first, as you say, Esther, is so important. So particularly with addiction, I think to build a relationship, and James, you noted it in our sort of pre-work here, it's just being authentic. So if I'd gone in with a list of, right, we've got to get to the bottom of this, or if you don't want to do it, no. But if I say, well, this is me and this is why I do it and this is why I care about you, I'm putting myself out there first and bringing myself to that discussion rather than making it about what you should and shouldn't, and this is all about you, and actually compounding that shame and blame culture. So that's kind of a starting point.
Could you respond to that, please, James, what it was like for you?
Yeah, that's absolutely how it worked with other therapists that I'd ever met in the past, and there's been a few for various different reasons. But I was never in a position, they were the teacher and I was the student, right? And it was very clear at the time that we were going in, they were the person that was fixed and they had it all sorted. And I was the one that was either, actually what you're trying to do is I'm trying to charm them and baffle them, challenge them into making me better. There is immediately, you're detached from the process as soon as you do that. Because I'm going in there with a big ego. I might be a bit broken, but I've got this ego that tells me that I can out-philosophize this person. But with Beth, it wasn't like that because, like she said, we knew that we both had an addiction or had addictions, and there was too many similarities in just the way that she was. There was no way that I was going to be charming myself out of this situation.
When you say similarities and addictions, Beth, are you able to explore that a bit more with us? What does James mean by that?
Well, to be honest with you, it's interesting because, to give you a bit of background on that, there's controversy in addictions therapy, particularly about how much to disclose of self. And I've always been very, very mindful of that. Everyone's got their own opinion on it. But for me, some of it sits uncomfortably about self-disclosure. But I think there's a way of doing it. And a self-disclosure might be just saying, I really felt pain when you said that. That's a real honest response. I'm not saying why. I'm not saying I've had that experience. I'm not saying this happened to me and I felt like that. I'm just sharing from my heart in that moment. It's here and now. However, if a client directly asks me a question, I'm going to answer it. And I think one of the things that stands out about James's journey when he was trying to charm me was about admiring my tattoos. And the particular tattoos are a remembrance of a friend of mine that died in addiction in his 20s. I don't see how that would be of value to hide that or to pretend it was something I liked. So I answered authentically.
That moment, me going, oh, I like your tattoos while sitting on the edge of the bed and, best filling out a form to see how crackpot I am at that point in my life. But, and me noticing more of the physicalities of Beth rather than actually what it is that we're talking about. And my immediate thought is, those are nice tattoos, Beth. And she just turned around and looked at me and said, the people that I've lost in my life due to this illness. And at that stage, you're like, oh, that's burst the bubble there, isn't it? At that point, I was so broken that was just a route in. And then as the weeks went on, we wore a lot of the same shoes, Beth. Do you remember that?
Yes, I do now you say it.
We turn up and I'd be wearing these nice Vans and Beth go, I've got those. Something else the next day. There were other contributing factors that weren't necessarily to do, that just sort of joined us together a little bit, But there was a very, very direct approach through that process with people, myself included, who were very sick or were using different mechanisms, like I would offer everyone my chocolate mousses rather than eating one myself. Does anyone want one of these things? Does anyone want one of those? Does anyone want a coffee? Does anyone want to wear this stuff? Does anyone want me to draw them a picture? Rather than actually concentrating on myself. And Beth would say, look, you've got to look at yourself. Stop thinking about other people. You are here for you. And that's a message that we have to talk in the evenings, in the other group meetings. We say it all the time. I'm here because I have to be here. I understand that I have to be here and learn from it. It's for me. And Beth was the first person, the only person at that stage that said that.
Okay, let's take a pause there. Come and have a free 15-minute consultation with one of our incredible multi-award-winning practitioners at Lifespan Psychology, the Diverse Practice. We're a multicultural team of doctorate-trained psychologists, psychotherapists and counsellors offering assessment, evidence-based talking therapy, coaching, training and consultations. We now also offer ADHD assessments in person and online. We work with a range of corporate, commercial and holistic companies and accept private medical insurance, referrals from the NHS, social care and rehabilitation companies. We also offer a range of fees for self-funding clients. Contact us at info@lifespanpsychology.co.uk or www.lifespan-psychology.com and follow us on our various social media channels in the show notes. Our clients at Lifespan Psychology are our true award winners. We're here because of you, we're an award-winning team because of you, and we're inspired to be the best that we can because of you. And how do we work across gender? Like you talked about being charming. You know, sometimes people do say that it's difficult, male-female kind of therapist duo. Some female therapists might say it's more difficult for me to work with men for various reasons, maybe because of the avoidance, maybe because of the shutting down, maybe because of the possibility of attraction or anything like that.
That needs to be worked on case by case. However, one of the things I like about that, sort of when we look at similarities, differences, for me, if we look at cross-gender, it actually can be really useful because there's a transference and a projection of feelings that goes on. And that if you're able to name it, if it's appropriate to do in the type of therapy you're doing or the setting you're doing, that is so powerful. And it might be the same with at the age I'm at now is what happens is I often get a projection of a mum figure, is I'm the mum. That's really useful. But I think it's how you name it and how you deliver it. And that's something about the individual relationship, because it might be that I can do that with one client. Yeah. So with James, that was something that worked really nicely for James. But the next client that comes along, it might be that I need to really tone that down because it's going to be too frightening to hear directly. It might be that mum was so direct that if I'm doing that, is mum also would send me up to my bedroom if I was upset or I got angry. And actually, I just wanted to share with her how I felt. So for me, that's the beauty of therapy, is that you can check that out by getting to know each other relationally. And the other beauty of therapists is I'm a human. I'm going to make mistakes too. And I can acknowledge that and call it out. And I encourage my clients to feed that back to me, because it helps us understand how we communicate with each other.
And from your perspective, because obviously you've explained that you're charming and you'd use other, distractions or methods to maybe avoid doing the work in therapy. How is it working with a female therapist?
Yeah, I mean, I think my character initially says, oh, she must be the one. That's literally, when I see someone doing an amazing chair and she's been, immediately my head goes into this weird fantasy, but obviously I'm a married man. I love my wife. That isn't the case. And those moments do come in, that does come into my head, and I talk about that a little bit as well, because it's wrong to follow up on those feelings, of course. What I've noticed in the rooms of recovery that I go to in the evening is that where people are super vulnerable, where they've not necessarily had any therapies or rehabilitation, where they're just going in vulnerable, I mean, it's scary what can happen in there if you've got a male and a female that are trying to help each other out, or one person is saying, I'm helping you out, and the other person is going, I need your help, because it creates some kind of codependency, which ultimately ends in failure, and it is really, really damaging and dangerous. I think, but from my experience with Beth and with a number of other therapists that I met in the Priory, it was compassionate, but it was direct, and there were certainly boundaries that could not be broken. And those boundaries were very, very clear. And actually, in some ways, if you had a male therapist, they were your mate. And the boundaries were a little bit different if you were the same gender. But for the female therapist, Beth in particular, this is the boundary. Do not cross it. If you do, then you'll be called out. It was very clear. So I think that this whole process has given me the opportunity to have a lot more respect around my relationships with females, how damaging or dangerous they can be. Because if I were to take on a female sponsor, how does that then arouse bitterness and jealousy with my wife? How does that affect that? And it's always that relationship that I refer back to and say, well, actually, I don't want to do that because you're cool over here. And if I start doing that, although it may seem nice and in my fantasy mind it's amazing, the reality is that it's going to cause distrust. And with that distrust comes a resentment for me. Why, how dare you, distrust me? I've been clean and sober for 5 years, blah, blah, blah. And all of a sudden that turns into something else. And those emotions I would rather not experience.
And I think you've just been extremely helpful there. What you've said has been amazing in explaining to people listening what are professional boundaries, what are ethical boundaries, what are fantasies, what are realities, because we all have fantasies in our head, and that's okay. It's okay to have a inner world that you don't act on, I suppose, and to be reflective and think, take a step back and look at what the implications would be. And yes, certainly there's not ethical to get into any sort of friendship or romantic relationship with a client, but it was just really to help the audience who may be skeptical about therapy or skeptical about how it works or not understanding how it works, how they might feel more comfortable working across gender. And we talk about, in other episodes, we talk about working across race, across faith, across, different intersections, because I think it's really powerful. I think we learn a lot from each other working cross-culturally or across genders and so on. Okay, great. So if you had to say in a nutshell, James, what the 3 breakthroughs were in your therapy journey, what would you say they were?
Accepting that I'm an addict and that is part of me. Accepting that the trauma that happened to me should not ever excuse my behaviour and should never be seen as an excuse to behave in a certain way or manipulate a situation. And faith in all kinds, so faithfulness, remaining faithful, and the meaning of faith.
Did you say faithfulness, remaining faithful, and being aware of your faith?
Yeah, and by that I mean I was told to keep my eyes open and look for the good things. The more good things that I see, the more you recognise that it's not all bad. The understanding that when someone is unfaithful, they're going down the wrong path. This is not about religion or God or anything like that. It's like, no, you remain honest and you remain open and vulnerable and willing to learn and just keep going.
Are those the breakthroughs that you observed as well in your work with James, Beth?
I did witness that. And I go back because I think what might be different with the sort of chat we're having today to some of the others is that actually the work we did in the main was group therapy, which is so powerful for me. I love it. I advocate it to all my clients now working as a lone practitioner because so much magic happens there. And to note that, I do remember that particular intake that James was in is that the lovely thing about working in rehab is that it's ever changing, but it's ever consistent at the same time. But what I specifically remember about that group of, I think it was nearly all men actually, if not all just men. And it was a big group at the time. I think it was full capacity, is that the question on everyone's lips was, what is spirituality? Because it's a word that's used a lot in addiction recovery. And it's a frightening word, especially it's not abnormal for people to have had really traumatic religious experiences coming into treatment. That's a real norm. Or for cross cultures. So it comes up a lot. And it's about how to unify a client group who might have got very varying faith bases and belief systems. And so it was quite a focus during that month. And I think things that spring to mind, that did spring to mind when James was speaking then was, I've heard it said, I can't remember who quoted it, but the more I pray, the more coincidences happen. That's kind of the sort of message that group was evoking, and the questions were never ending. How do I do this? What about this? Why does this work? What do they mean by that in 12-step fellowships? So it's a really lovely experience for me. The other thing that really stands out is we did a lot of work on interpersonal relationships with that particular group. But what stands out with James was we did a lot of work around people pleasing. And it was a lovely journey because that, I think, a lot of us can identify with that go into therapy. And it was a really lovely experience that James was willing to receive that feedback, which every group member had some, and myself included, reflect on that every time we do that lecture. But James really ran with that and was willing and open to work on it. So that stands out for me.
Oh, they're really powerful reflections. Thank you so much. What I want to do now is maybe take stock of like how many sessions you had and what the therapeutic input was so that people can really kind of visualize it. Because I know you were in Priory Hospital, so you were an inpatient. You had a group, so you had a 12-step fellowship. I'm not a specialist in addiction, so this is all really fascinating and also just incredibly helpful. Can you talk me through like how many sessions and what the structure of the intervention is, please, Beth?
Yeah, so I mean, at that point, I was working in a rehab, so I ran an addiction treatment program for a priory group. And standardly, it's a 28-day inpatient program with up to a year's aftercare and the option to carry on and volunteer. So during inpatient, it's pretty much a 9 to 5 program with an expectation to go to a minimum of 3 or 2, I think it was at that priory, 12-step fellowship meetings a week, such as Narcotics Anonymous, Alcoholics Anonymous, Cocaine Anonymous, Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous. So it's a really, really intense program, but I want to be really clear to anyone listening, that's not the only way. What it springboarded for me, because the addiction is kind of really a habit we've got into that hides a lot more. And so for me, you've asked me as we've gone along this journey, Esther, what do I do? Well, my background's mental health nursing, and then very quickly retraining as an addictions therapist to go alongside that. But I've always felt a bit sad that that was all there was, because as James has sort of shared today, is that when we manage the addiction and we get some control over it, what's behind it? And I've gone on to do training in that, because the common themes for me were always trauma that hadn't been resolved, sex and relationship difficulties, and often nowadays, because it's something we know about and is more acknowledged, is neurodiversity. There are challenges in life that addiction wants to get its hands round. So I've gone on to train in those things, because for me, to take away a substance or a behaviour from someone and just say, go off and live with your pain, is no good. No one's picked up a drug or a drink or a behaviour to, punish themselves or anyone else. It's a way of coping and survival. So I feel that part of addiction therapy for me is the longer term journey, and how do I embrace those pains, fears, needs in a different way?
Absolutely brilliant. And did you want to speak to that, James?
Yeah, I mean, when you get past the point where you've got rid of what is at the time the solution, which is the drink and drugs, then you're kind of left with yourself. And then it really is, well, there's no destination at that point, is there? You've just got to keep going, and things come up and you keep moving forwards. But there is always this kind of sense of, am I worthy of this? Can I accept the merits that are coming my way? Because those things are still there. It's still, there's still that I'm a bit different, not quite good enough. That is the neurodiversity that Beth talks about. And I know that I'm different. I know that I'm creative. I know that I can go, I'll do this thing for a lot, obsessively. If I was drawing, I would draw for 8 hours a day until my pans swell up. I don't do things in a kind of sensible, moderate way. I do them to death. And that character trait is relevant in everything that I do. In relationships, my relationships with same-sex or cross-genders is exactly the same. I kind of suck the life and soul out of those people. I'm a lot more mindful about this stuff now. And through this process, I've created my own boundaries around those things. When I'm entering a new relationship or a new project, that I'm understanding the way where that takes me if I'm not being mindful about my side of it and how toxic these things can be, how obsessive I can be. I'll give you one example of this is the sickest I've been in the last 5 years. When I was 50, my wife said to me, I'll buy you a watch. Right? She told me that in October. My birthday's in December. I spent 9 weeks every day looking at watches. That's all I did. I was like, how much money do you want to spend? That's not enough. I'm going to have to sell this thing, do that thing. And all of a sudden, I made myself really ill about, because it was all I was thinking about. And it's just those little things that you recognize in yourself along the way that you go, actually, if you want to buy me a watch, just go and buy me a watch. Surprise me. That kind of simple stuff that you start to realize that, these simple things really affect everything. That's where you get to, I think, when you come out of an ATP program, you've no longer got drink or drugs in you. And all of a sudden you've got to survive and you have pain, but you don't know where the pain is going to come from. And it could be those very simple things that cause it.
Yeah, and drugs and alcohol, it's a coping mechanism. It helps mask the underlying pain. But what you're saying is without that, you're then left with the raw version of yourself. And what you found was you were more obsessive, or it was harder to control obsessions.
Yeah, as obsessive. Remember, my drug and alcohol taking was completely secret. So my wife didn't even know when I told her that, I'm alcohol dependent. All of that I was holding on to has suddenly been exposed. That was a very difficult place to be. I think that is the secrecy and shame around that type of abuse, that type of life. And, the longer that goes on is incredibly damaging and difficult to come back from. But once you have broken down those doors, then you can truly recover, really. And then it's dealing with the day-to-day pains of life, as Beth said.
And how do you do that, Beth? Because what we're trying to create an understanding of is how a therapist can support somebody with this behaviour change, this positive behaviour change. So you can kind of rewrite your life story with it. That's what's so magic about therapy, I think. How do you break down those walls and then change certain behaviours like that?
Well, that's an interesting one. So some feedback I'll often get from people is, someone said it to me in the summer, is, oh, how do you do your job? It's so sad. Is it hell? It's fun. It's exciting. But actually it has to be sad, because if I can't feel sad, I can't feel happy. So we have to have it all. And it's something about accepting all of that. And I was listening to James talking then and about, secret drinking and about obsession and about sort of, putting down. And it's like, if you think back to what James sort of courageously shared at the beginning, which is maybe the start of some of this journey, or part of it, is that having to hide something from his gran, something that was really, really painful and frightening, blaming self for, sort of, coming up to rehab 5 years ago, that 10-year-old is still having to hide a lot of stuff. It's that 10-year-old hasn't grown out of that yet. It's not because it's stupid, it's because it worked really well for a long, long time in keeping safe. But what it's also done is learn how to have fun with drugs and alcohol as part of that journey, because the other fun wasn't happening. It was too frightening. So there's two bits to it. One of it is we don't go there straight away. We just look at right now. We can't go right back there, because if the answer was that simple, you'd have found it. But today we can look at how you feel safe with feeling angry that the nurse banged on your door at the wrong time, or that your peer's not putting in enough work and you're really, really worried about it. And looking at how to bring focus to today is one thing. But there has to be fun, because I think when trauma comes into it, we often haven't developed enough to be able to know how to have that every day. And that is an absolute luxury, to work with people, to learn how to rest a bit more and how to have a bit more fun along the way, and embrace that is sometimes harder than embracing the sadness, the pain, the frustration. So I've got a lovely job, really, because we're just being real all the time. And that does include fun, joy, happiness and peace. And bringing that into the program, whether I'm doing one-to-one or group therapy, trauma work, addiction, it's part of therapy.
And what would you say, James, the fun and the light and the hope and the joy, and how did you receive that in the intervention 5 years ago?
It's an amazing group of people that were there to start off with. And it was like you found your tribe, All of a sudden, I didn't feel like a fox at Crufts. It was like, these people actually get me. That, like Beth says, it was kind of constantly changing, but it was always the same. And people would come in with slightly different views and different angers and different backgrounds and different things going on. And mine, really just exposing myself allowed me the 28 days to really soak in as much as I could. I was unblocked, so I was able to absorb stuff. But we had a lot of fun. We had so much fun. There were so many good, intelligent characters. And I believe that, anyone that goes through that process, and the feeling that you get when you're surrounded by people that are also going through that process, and their own trials and their own tribulations, and their own letters from home and their own drawings that they've got to do to express how they feel today, all of that stuff, that, you sort of have this sense of fear around it. Once you've got rid of that fear and expressed yourself, then you just feel elated and light. And there's still fun now. I still have a lot of joy in my life. Experienced sadness recently like I've never experienced before, like real sadness, and it was like almost like a brand new emotion for me. I really did. The only thing that I felt was sad. And that, when my friend recently died, and it was just, it is a valuable emotion to recognize how you feel when it passes. It's that emotion, I think, that is one that was arrested during my development as a young adult. I never felt sad before. And honestly, I think the last month is the first time I've truly felt sad, and I didn't know what it was.
And from what you had said to me when we met before, your friend took their own life very, very sadly, and that you had seen how much you had to live for. It almost, whilst you were immensely sadder than you'd ever been by the sounds of it, it also given you that perspective that could have been me.
Can I speak very openly about this particular bit? But when we went through the process and we ended up, we talked to a lot of people about, that this lady had passed, and we didn't ever sort of explain the circumstances. But when we were in the crematorium, I understand that person's pain. I understand where they were and the neurodiversity that they were struggling with. And I understand now that she's in peace. And there were a lot of sad people there, but she was at peace. And that sometimes is a seductive thought. I can be seduced by that because it is part of my story. That is something that's in my control to survive. And, fortunately, I recognize that was deep sadness and grief about someone that I loved dearly. And that's how it manifested in me. And I came away from that. I talked about it. I was vulnerable in front of people about how I felt about it. I didn't feel jealous, but I did feel some seduction from the fact that is inside your control to do. And then I looked at all the handbrakes that I have around me, love that I have for my wife, my children, my parents, which keep me here. But ultimately, that's really how I felt about it. So it was a really deep reflection.
And I think it'd probably be important for our listeners to understand, how long did those thoughts last? How long did that seduction last for you? Was it fleeting, or was it kind of last a long time?
I think after I'd realised, really what was going on, I think maybe a couple of days. So a fleeting idea, and then trying to process it and talking about it was probably a couple of days before us being able to go, actually, this is kind of normal. And I believe that a lot of people would feel that kind of emotion, perhaps.
It's something about the self-sabotage that is part of your story, isn't it? That it took you to that place for 2 days, but ultimately you've triumphed over that, and that's not who you are anymore. But there's a part of you, and you talked about neurodiversity as well. Beth, have you got any comments on that at all?
Yeah, I'm really glad the subject of suicide's come up, because for me as a practitioner, thinking about my own journey of sort of 20 years in mental health, I just know that there was a time where the word suicide was really sensitive to me in my career, early days, and even maybe up to mid days. And knowing that I had to ask every client about how they felt and whether suicide had crossed their mind, or if they was there active suicide? Had there ever been suicide thoughts like that? And actually, it's something I'm super comfortable talking about now, not because I'm insensitive, because I know it's real and it must be acknowledged. So I'm glad it's come up today. For me, if we tie it into addiction, what I love about 12-step fellowships, and often I've had feedback for, it's really negative. Someone said they were suicidal last night. I'm vulnerable. It's really helpful, because if someone can talk about it in that space, that can diffuse it. And if we're not having spaces to diffuse it, that gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So the fact it's come up today, that it's something that happens to many, many people. In fact, it's possibly more of a norm to have had a thought like that than not. Great talk about it. It's a real thing.
The people that I spoke to, because I was like, I just don't know why, I feel so sad. And all of these things are coming up. And they were so kind, saying things like, yeah, well, trust me, I know where you're coming from. It's enough to know that that person has also thought the same thing at times. And those thoughts do pass.
Okay, let's take a pause there. The National Health Service had its 76th birthday this year. I personally believe that health is the most important form of wealth, and it should be free at the point of need for everyone on the planet. We're therefore fundraising for NHS Charities Together and hoping to raise £10,000 per year through this podcast. NHS Charities Together currently fund over 4,000 projects to support staff and patients to build a brighter future for the NHS. Find out more from our fundraising page in the show notes. This podcast is free to listen to, but we recommend a one-off donation of the cost of your therapy session or anything you can afford, so we can reach our £10,000 target every year to support the NHS. I've donated the price of my therapy session, and my company will continue to sponsor this podcast and fundraise for the NHS as long as we're able to. Please rate, like, share and subscribe to this podcast to spread the word. If you would like to sponsor us or feature on the show, please email info@breakingthroughtherapy.com. What I wanted to help our listeners understand is how you've improved your relationships and what tools and techniques you may have got from Beth. These are really profound. What you've basically said is your relationships are your handbrakes, they're your protective factors. So something must have changed along the way to improve your, close relationships, your friendships, and how you operate in those relationships. Because I think you were saying before that, sometimes the shame, the secrecy, the lies, the deception, that can have an impact on the relationship, can't it? With people close to you. So how did you work through that?
I started to understand that, that I would use people as soon as I stopped using drink or drugs. I understood that, people were going to become something that I was going to use. And my relationships, more personal relationships with my wife and things like that, I think it went through a period of being okay. Then it got a bit of distance in the relationship. Then we reconnected. I've been with my wife for 37 years. We're going to have some distance. And then when I came in and met Beth the first time, one of the things that I considered to be the reasons why I was unhappy was that there wasn't enough sex in my relationship. The success of my relationship was based on the frequency of sex. And as we've grown into this relationship and I've grown into my recovery, I've realized that my love for my wife far exceeds anything that is like that, right? So here's a quick example. She was diagnosed with breast cancer a year ago. She went through surgery and, we've had the best result that we could possibly have. We're very happy. But during that process, I was walking the dog. Everyone in the house is super anxious. I've got 2 children. They're very anxious about my wife. My wife's super anxious about having cancer. I was walking the dog and I just thought, what really is love? Because I was out in the rain with the dog. And I thought to myself that there's nothing I could ever own, nothing I own now or could ever own in the future that I would not willingly give to take this away from my wife. And that was truly my thought. It changed my outlook on love at that moment. It really did, because all of a sudden I'm like, well, my relationship is not about that physical transaction. It's about, how can I support this person? And also keep myself safe at the same time, rather than reaching out for something else, So that was a big step in my relationships. Other relationships, I just recognize which ones are toxic and which ones are not. And I tell you what, I will tell the person, we together at this point, this is going to go badly. We need to be really careful of this relationship. I'm very, very comfortable at telling people that now. I'm like this, you're like this.
Oh, I love that. The healthy boundaries and knowing yourself, knowing the other person, knowing what the interaction between the two of you are, what combination that you make. And that was really lovely the way you put it. It's not blaming anyone. It's like the chemistry between us equals toxic. It's not blaming them. It's not blaming you. It's just, this is not working out. That was really helpful. Thank you for helping us reframe, redefine what love is. I think it makes a lot of sense what you said about, if you've had issues about controlling impulses and stuff and obsessional thoughts and behaviours, it makes sense what you said about the way you were measuring love. Did you have anything you wanted to add there, Beth, about what you maybe did in the relationship, in the group, in terms of relationships and how you talked about that?
Well, we did so much because it's all based on sort of relational content, but actually it brought back a memory of James because we did an art therapy group in that cohort and it was draw love, and he did actually draw his wife, caring for the family. So that memory came up for me. But no, we did absolutely loads. We'd look at ways that we communicate with ourselves, learning how to do that in a loving way before we started trying to roll it out to others. I think the other thing that more and more I'm working with relationally is remembering there's different parts of us and they might want different things at the same time, and being able to, on our own, listen to those bits. And like any parent, we're trying to meet loads of different needs. Super important. And if we've got all of that for ourselves, then when we bring in another person with all their own needs and ways of communicating, it's really, really hard sometimes to make sense of it if we're not listening to ourselves. And I think that's something that was really powerful in James's journey and in lots of clients' journey. It's that self-reflection
of our different parts. Yeah. Is that internal family systems? What's the model for that?
Yeah, and I don't like to put people off with names because there's so many of it. Can be internal family systems, can be transactional analysis. I mean, they're just the two that I use most frequently. But I think, even in a meeting, I want to give up alcohol, but I love it. It's two different parts, isn't it? And just sort of neither of them are awful and neither of them are right. There's some negotiation going here. So being able to take and receive feedback, super important.
Thank you. That's really helpful. For anyone listening, it might be really helpful to just specifically, if you know what type of neurodiversity, like if you have a diagnosis, if you could tell us, and also what the substance was. You mentioned alcohol, but what was the substance, James?
When I was at school, it was Tipex thinners, aerosol, glue, hash, and then it turned into acid, mushrooms, speed for a long time. Then it turned into healthy living, exercise, over-exercise, more exercise, and then eventually turned into secret alcoholism and other drugs, whatever I could get, really.
That's really helpful to hear the whole kind of continuum over time. And in terms of neurodiversity, do you have a diagnosis just for our listeners so that if anyone is listening, who can identify with what you've described today?
I have a strong suspicion I may have ADHD. But to be perfectly honest with you, I'm very happy with myself.
Great. That's what we like to hear.
So I'm kind of authentically on a stable path. I understand a lot about coping with the way that my mind works. And I'm constantly doing that. That's my life. My life, my whole being, it seems to be controlled by my mind and my memories and my thoughts and emotions. So if I can stay in touch with those things, then I have a good chance.
And I think what you said is really powerful. There are no two brains in this world that are alike. As far as I'm concerned, we're all unique. And it's about how you kind of harness the power of the way your mind works. And there will always be positives, won't they? Any positive and negative sort of like elements of our cognitive abilities. Like there's always going to be pros and cons. So I think it's really great that you can harness all your strengths. And you've put it to great use, haven't you, in the work you're doing? Could you tell us a bit about the work you're doing? And then I'll ask you for some advice to somebody who maybe was skeptical about therapy, what you would say to them.
I subscribe to a 12-step fellowship and I love it very much. It's a very safe space for people to express themselves. And that can be across all sorts of things. So when people first come into that room or those rooms, they're met with love and without judgment, regardless of what condition they're in. And, the very first person, I remember going there really, really scared. One evening outside of rehab, I think I was having a cigarette and a cup of coffee, and then someone went to hug me. And very difficult to hug at this moment, right? So I tipped my coffee down his jacket.
Oh!
And it's like outside the room, it's like full of, scaffolders and all the various different people all laughing and joking. And I just looked at this guy and he went, I think you need another cup of coffee, mate. And that was it, man. He was just like, he's one of my closest friends now, but that was nearly 5 years ago. In any other walk of life, you probably would have been in a bit of a fight. In that arena where it's so diverse, no one's going to entertain any kind of bullying or harassment in that way. And it changed my life because I think if he had reacted differently, it would have been much more difficult for me to go back to that meeting. And those meetings have truly taught me so much and given me the opportunity 3 nights a week to express how I feel and to listen to other people and how they feel.
Is that something you're ongoing and you do ongoing then? Since 2019. And are you also sponsoring people? So are you like mentoring people through the program as well?
Yeah. I'm actually now, I think I'm a great grand sponsor. When you sponsor someone, they sponsor someone, they sponsor someone. So it's quite happy with that.
Of course. And Beth, what would you say to someone who's skeptical of starting this journey? Because it's an intense journey from what you described. And then it's a lifelong one as well, because of the way that we are made when our brains are sort of hardwired for addiction. It's like, there is no, we'll just do 10 sessions and then that's it, from the sounds of things. Is that right?
Yes and no. I mean, going back 10 or 15 years ago when I trained in this, it was really different. There'd be really black and white answers. If you've got to do this, if you don't go to meetings, you're going to die. It's very, very different now, but there's much more of an understanding about the pain behind addiction. And I really keep an open mind with clients. I can give evidence of journeys that I can see working better or not so well and look at the common denominators. And meetings do tend to be one. But I'm not going to sort of say to someone you can't recover without that, because that's really condemning. But I do encourage for people that don't want to do a 12-step program for whatever reason is that let's find another community to tap into, because we know it's a relational condition. We know that the opposite of sort of addiction isn't sobriety. It's actually connecting. It stops us connecting with self and others. So it's really useful to have somewhere to practice those connections and experiencing our emotions in front of others, or knowing where we react or where we respond well. And meetings are a perfect place for that. And it's super uncomfortable. So I know that if I'm saying that to someone who might be coming to me for weekly therapy without the sort of support of rehab or the affirmation that I'm ill enough to have to go to hospital for this, that's really, really hard and a big ask for people. But I think if I can start building that relationship and we're playing out some of that discomfort and looking at day-to-day, interactions, that's going to be a really good starting place.
Those are brilliant points that you've made. It must feel like utter dread. We've got Amy Winehouse in my head. I don't want to go to rehab, But the way you've actually depicted it, you've talked about community, you've talked about fun, you've talked about self-discovery, you've talked about spirituality, deepening your relationships, prolonging your life, increasing your health, and connecting with people for years to come. And I think that is just such a positive, wonderful way to end this. Just one final word from James then. If someone was really sceptical about going to rehabilitation for addictions or having any group or individual therapy, what would you say to them?
I would say there's nothing to be scared of. Really, you're just being restored to the point where you're a better person. And to be as honest as humanly possible without wanting to blame or harm other people. If you can keep that, so you're just, I'm going to do the right thing. I need to expose myself for myself in front of people that aren't going to judge me. And that's enough, that's the starting point of getting better. And life only gets better as you become more connected. And that's in every sense, in every sense. Just do it. It's a beautiful thing to do. It's the best thing that I've ever done in my life. It saved my life, and it saved other people's lives because of it. And just being able to be well enough to do this and to be able to help other people and help myself as well is a gift that I would not have got had I not embarked on this journey.
Absolutely amazing. Thank you both so much for coming today. This podcast is not a replacement for professional, psychological or psychiatric help. You can book an appointment with our team on info@lifespanpsychology.co.uk, but we do not provide a crisis service. If you've been affected by any of the content and need to speak to somebody urgently, please contact your GP to make a referral for talking therapies. You can contact NHS 111 out of hours or the Samaritans on 116 123. Childline also offer a free confidential helpline for children and young people in distress and offer support from counsellors online. Call 0800 1111 or go to www.childline.org.uk. If you're worried about someone's safety, please call 999 and bring them to the Accident and Emergency Service. You can contact the charity CALM, Campaign Against Living Miserably, or NSPCC for Children. These resources are in the show notes. Thank you for being part of the Breaking Through Therapy community. I would also like to thank the composer of this theme tune. It's called Bliss by Luke Bergs. Let's dive into more conversations that change the courses of people's lives in upcoming episodes.